Millionaire takes homeless man off the streets, but when he discovers the truth, everything changes. He did a good deed, but when the truth comes out, everything he believed about life is turned upside down. Don't miss the moment that will change everything. Marcelo stormed out of his high-rise office building, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors as he moved swiftly toward the parking garage. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it, the screen lighting up with emails and calls he had no intention of answering. Another day, another endless list of business deals and corporate meetings that blurred into one. He was good at his job. Too good, some might say. But what did it all amount to? Another victory, another sale, and yet nothing inside him had changed. The emptiness remained. As he slid into the driver's seat of his black luxury car, a glimpse of something outside caught his eye. He didn't know why he noticed it at first. Perhaps it was the man sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. His clothes were ragged, and his face was rough with age. But there was something in the way he held himself. The man's eyes, tired but calm, met Marcelo's for a brief moment. Marcelo's hand froze on the door handle. He had seen homeless people before. Every city had its share, but something about this man was different. There was no begging, no desperation in his gaze. Just a quiet resignation that somehow pulled at Marcelo's conscience, though he could not fully explain why. For a second, Marcelo hesitated. Should he just drive away? After all, it was none of his business. He had work to do. He had a life to manage. But then he found himself opening the car door, his steps unplanned but purposeful as he approached the man on the sidewalk. "Hey, you need help?" Marcelo asked, his voice barely above a whisper, not sure what he was expecting. He had never spoken to a homeless person before, at least not like this. The man looked up slowly, as though surprised that someone had bothered to stop. He studied Marcelo for a moment, sizing him up before nodding faintly. "I don't need much," the man said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Just some food. A place to rest would be good, but I don't ask for anything more." Marcelo found himself thinking about his life, the way he rushed through each day, filling the hours with meetings and strategies, but never stopping to consider the real meaning behind any of it. "Where do you stay?" Marcelo pressed. He didn't know why he was asking. It was unlike him to make such an offer, but something about the man's serenity unnerved him, made him feel uncomfortable in a way that he couldn't put into words. The man sighed, lifting his hand to point vaguely toward a nearby alley. "There," he said simply. "You'll find plenty like me." Marcelo stared at him, his mind racing. What was he thinking? This wasn't something he usually did. He didn't get involved in causes, didn't waste time helping strangers. He had a reputation to maintain, a brand to protect. But somehow, standing there, he felt an urge to do something different, something that might fill the growing emptiness inside him. "I can offer you more than food," Marcelo said, surprising even himself with his words. "I can give you a place to stay, a job. You could start over. Come with me." The man's eyes searched Marcelo's face, as though weighing the offer. He didn't seem eager, but neither did he dismiss it. Slowly, the man nodded, his eyes softening. "I didn't expect this," he murmured. "But sure, I'll go with you. But not for pity. Only if you mean it." Marcelo didn't know what he meant by that. He didn't care. All he knew was that for some reason he needed to help. He needed to fill that hole inside him. And perhaps, just maybe, this man could help him do that. "All right, let's go," Marcelo said, already regretting the words as they left his mouth. But it was too late. He had made the decision. As they walked toward Marcelo's car, the weight of his choice settled over him. This was more than just a random act of kindness. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet understand. But Marcelo couldn't back out now. He had made the offer, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that might actually mean something. The drive to Marcelo's penthouse felt longer than it should. The man, Jose, as he had introduced himself, sat silently in the passenger seat, his weathered hands folded in his lap, staring out the window. Marcelo's mind was clouded, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in him during the brief encounter. He glanced at Jose several times, but the man gave no sign of wanting to speak. Marcelo wasn't sure why he had made the offer. Sure, he had a reputation to protect, and surely it would look good for a man like him to be seen helping someone from the streets, but that wasn't the reason. He could feel it deep down. There was something about Jose that had sparked an unexpected pull inside him. When they arrived at Marcelo's building, the doorman gave him an odd glance. Marcelo waved it off, gesturing for Jose to follow him. The elevator ride was equally silent, and Marcelo couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast between his world and Jose's. The polished, sleek interior of the elevator, the designer suit he wore, the pristine floors, the marble walls. All of it seemed so distant from the ragged life Jose had just left behind. As they reached Marcelo's apartment, he unlocked the door and stepped aside for Jose to enter. The space was grand, with tall windows that provided a breathtaking view of the city. It was empty in the sense that it felt like a showcase more than a home. There was no warmth here, just the cold reflection of his success. Jose stepped in slowly, taking everything in with a careful glance. "It's impressive," he said, his voice flat, as if trying to make sense of the enormity of it all. "Make yourself comfortable," Marcelo said quickly, gesturing to a leather armchair near the living room. "I'll get you something to eat. It's been a long day, I'm sure." Jose nodded, but didn't sit down right away. He paced the room, his eyes tracing the expensive furniture and minimalistic decor. "You live like this every day?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Yeah," Marcelo replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's what I've worked for. You know, success." Jose turned to face him, eyes narrowing slightly. "And is that all you have?" Marcelo faltered for a moment, surprised by the bluntness. It was a question he didn't have an easy answer for. He opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped. What was there to say? He had everything a person could want: money, power, a place like this, but he hadn't felt truly content in years. Couldn't remember the last time he had really smiled, laughed, or felt anything beyond the numbness that had crept in over the years. "Well, yeah," he finally muttered. "I guess so." Jose's gaze softened. "You can buy all the things you want, but it won't fill the hole inside you," he said almost matter-of-factly. "I know that from experience." Marcelo froze. The words hit him like a punch in the stomach. It was as if Jose had taken a snapshot of his soul, reading him better than anyone else had in years. Marcelo wasn't sure how to respond. Should he deny it? Should he argue? Instead, he turned toward the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water and a sandwich, his mind still reeling from the man's insight. As he set the food down on the table in front of Jose, the silence between them grew thick. Jose didn't reach for the food immediately. Instead, he looked at Marcelo with a gaze that was a mix of curiosity and understanding. "I didn't come here for charity, you know," Jose said quietly, breaking the silence. "You offer me a place to stay, but I'm not here to just be taken care of. I've lived on my own, in the dirt, and I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me. If you really want to help, you'll have to understand that." Marcelo felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. He wasn't offering charity. At least, that's not how he had seen it. He had wanted to help, hadn't he? But he had to admit, perhaps Jose was right. Marcelo hadn't yet understood what it meant to truly help someone. "I understand," Marcelo said after a moment, his voice quieter than he intended. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I thought you could use some stability." Jose nodded, a small glint of gratitude in his eyes. "Stability doesn't mean much if you don't have peace," he said, picking up the sandwich and taking a bite. "Sometimes, peace is the hardest thing to find." Marcelo sank into the couch across from him, still processing what Jose had said. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own choices, the lack of peace in his own life. As Jose finished his meal, Marcelo's thoughts drifted. Maybe he had been wrong to think that helping Jose was about fixing him. Maybe it was about fixing something in himself. The evening dragged on in silence as Marcelo and Jose sat in the spacious living room, each lost in their own thoughts. Marcelo hadn't expected this. The raw honesty of Jose's words, the way they seemed to reach into his chest and stir up a realization he had been avoiding for years. He had spent his life building walls around himself, perfecting a persona of control, power, and success. But in the presence of this man, whose life was filled with struggle and loss, Marcelo felt exposed. Vulnerable. Jose seemed to sense this. He didn't push, didn't pry further, but the quiet between them had an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that there was more going on here than just a simple act of charity. It wasn't about helping Jose, at least not in the way Marcelo had expected. It was about something else, something Marcelo wasn't sure he was ready to confront yet. Finally, Jose broke the silence. "So, tell me, Marcelo," he said, his voice calm but searching. "Why did you offer me a place to stay?" Marcelo looked up from the glass in his hand, his fingers absently tracing the rim. "I don't know," he admitted, the words coming out more easily than he anticipated. "I saw you and something about you made me want to help. I guess I thought it would make me feel better, like I was doing something good, maybe even filling a gap in my own life." Jose studied him closely. "A gap in your life," he repeated slowly, almost to himself. "I thought people like you, people with all this, didn't have gaps. You've got money, success, everything." Marcelo scoffed quietly, his lips curling in a humorless smile. "That's what everyone thinks, right? That money fixes everything. But it doesn't." He paused, his voice softening. "It hasn't for me. I've got everything I ever wanted, and yet I don't feel fulfilled. Not like I thought I would." Jose leaned forward, his eyes not judgmental, but understanding. "That's the thing with people like you," he said gently. "You think having more will fill the emptiness, but it just keeps growing until it feels like you're drowning in it." Marcelo swallowed, the weight of those words sinking deep into his chest. He couldn't argue with Jose. There was truth in them, truth he had been denying for so long. "Why are you still out there, Jose?" Marcelo asked suddenly, almost desperately. "Why don't you get a job? Get a place to live, like I did?" Jose exhaled a deep sigh, looking out the window, his gaze distant as he considered the question. "You think it's that simple?" he asked, his voice tinged with sadness. "You think you can just get a job and be saved from everything? From the pain? The loss?" "I've tried, Marcelo, but sometimes the world isn't kind. And sometimes people like me, we don't get second chances." Marcelo flinched at the finality in Jose's words. He didn't know how to respond. He had always believed in hard work, in the idea that anyone could change their circumstances if they just tried hard enough. But Jose's words shook that belief to its core. There was silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Marcelo felt the weight of the conversation pressing on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was as if the walls he had spent years constructing were beginning to crack, one small piece at a time. Jose continued, almost to himself. "I didn't choose to be on the streets, you know? But life doesn't always give you a choice. And when it takes everything from you, you have to figure out how to survive. But surviving isn't living, Marcelo." "Not really." Marcelo stared at him, caught in the gravity of Jose's words. For the first time, he understood the depth of what Jose had been through. Not just the physical hardship, but the emotional scars that came with it. The kind of pain that no amount of money could erase. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "So, what should I do then? What's the point of all this?" "I thought," he broke off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. He had thought that helping Jose would somehow make him feel better, that it would be enough to give him a sense of purpose. But now he wasn't so sure. Jose looked at him, his expression softening. "The point, Marcelo, is to stop running from the truth. Stop filling your life with distractions. You want to help me? You want to fix something? Then start by understanding that we're all broken in some way. We all have scars, whether we show them or not." The truth of Jose's words hit Marcelo hard, like a wave crashing over him. He had spent so long running from his own pain, from the things he had lost in the past, that he had never taken the time to heal. He had built his empire, yes, but it was built on sand, and he knew it now. It would never be enough to fix what was missing inside him. Marcelo leaned back in the chair, his mind racing, his heart heavy. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. "I don't even know where to start." Jose gave him a small smile, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "You start by stopping, Marcelo, by looking at your own cracks before you try to fix mine. Sometimes, helping someone else means helping yourself first." Marcelo didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure he could even begin to process what Jose had just shared with him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was starting to see things clearly. Maybe it wasn't about helping Jose. Maybe it was about confronting his own demons. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way forward. Marcelo woke up early the next morning, the weight of the conversation with Jose still hanging in the air. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. He found himself staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun rise over the city, painting the skyline in shades of gold and orange. It should have been peaceful, but instead, the silence felt oppressive. He glanced over at Jose, still asleep on the couch where Marcelo had insisted he rest. He hadn't expected the man to stay the night, but Jose had been too exhausted to leave. Marcelo had given him a spare blanket, though part of him wondered if Jose even needed it. The man seemed to carry his own warmth, an unspoken strength that kept him going despite everything life had thrown at him. Marcelo's thoughts kept returning to what Jose had said about brokenness. It wasn't just about the streets. It wasn't just about survival. Marcelo realized it was about something deeper, about accepting that no matter how much wealth and success a person had, they were still vulnerable, still capable of being hurt, of being lost. As the morning wore on, Marcelo found himself becoming restless. He needed answers. He needed to understand, and he wasn't sure where to turn. So, he did the only thing he knew. He threw himself into work. He called his assistant, arranged meetings, and buried himself in emails and phone calls. It was easier this way. The world of business was predictable, concrete. It didn't ask questions that Marcelo wasn't ready to answer. But as the day went on, a thought kept nagging at him. A question that he couldn't shake. Why had he helped Jose in the first place? It wasn't for charity. It wasn't even for a tax break or for the public image. No, there was something about Jose that had stirred something in him, something that Marcelo had long since buried. It was the way Jose had spoken, the way he had looked at Marcelo with a kind of quiet wisdom that made him feel exposed. It was the way Jose had seen right through him, piercing through the armor of success and money that Marcelo had so carefully built. Marcelo had tried to bury his past, to pretend that the pain of losing his family, of losing himself and his work, didn't matter. But it did. It always had. And Jose, this stranger from the streets, had somehow forced Marcelo to confront it. He had been avoiding the truth for so long that, despite everything, he had never felt whole. And now he had to face it. Marcelo's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of an important meeting that was about to start. He glanced at the clock and stood up, pacing toward the door. He could go on, just as he always had. He could keep pretending that everything was fine, that he had it all together. But the truth was staring him in the face now, and there was no ignoring it. The decision gnawed at him. Part of him wanted to stay in the safety of his carefully constructed life, to keep going day after day, hiding behind his wealth and his status. But Jose had shown him something different. He had shown him the vulnerability of being human. And as much as Marcelo wanted to deny it, he knew he could never go back to the way things were. He stepped out of his apartment, the cool air hitting his face as he walked down the hallway to the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, he made up his mind. "Cancel my meetings for the day," Marcelo said to his assistant, his voice calm but resolute. "I have something I need to do." The decision had been made. Marcelo had no idea where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He didn't know how to help Jose, or even if he could, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about helping someone from the streets. It was about helping himself, and he wasn't going to waste another moment running from that truth. Marcelo found himself standing in front of the door to his office, but for the first time in years, he hesitated. His hand lingered on the handle, his thoughts swirling in a storm of doubt and uncertainty. It wasn't the work waiting inside that made him pause. It was the sense that he was on the verge of something much bigger than anything he had ever faced before. He had spent his life building walls around his heart, hiding from the pain of loss. But now, it seemed those walls were starting to crumble. And the more he thought about Jose, about the things they had talked about, the more he realized that he couldn't hide from the past forever. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the office was exactly as it had always been, clean, pristine, and cold. The polished wood desk gleamed under the bright overhead lights, and the towering windows offered a view of the city skyline. It was a place where Marcelo had always felt in control, where he could focus on the business at hand and avoid the feelings he didn't want to confront. But today, the emptiness of the space felt suffocating. The vastness of the room seemed to mirror the vast emptiness inside him. He sat down at his desk, his fingers lightly tapping against the smooth surface. His mind drifted back to the night before, to Jose's words. Stop running from the truth. How could Marcelo not? He had spent so long burying his pain under layers of success, under the facade of a perfect life. But Jose had cracked it open. Jose had reminded him of the brokenness he had been trying to outrun. And now, Marcelo was left with a choice. Continue pretending that everything was fine, or face the truth of his own past, the truth that had shaped him into the man he had become. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Marcelo's gaze flickered to the framed photograph on his desk. A picture of his family, taken years ago. His father, his mother, and himself standing together in front of their old house. A younger, happier version of Marcelo smiled in the photo, his arm around his father's shoulders. He looked carefree, untouched by the pain that would eventually tear his world apart. That day had been one of the happiest moments of his life, but now it felt like a distant memory, one buried under years of grief, anger, and regret. His father, a man who had built everything from the ground up, had always taught him that success was the only thing that mattered. Money doesn't just change your life, Marcelo, his father had said, his voice firm with conviction. It makes you untouchable. But Marcelo hadn't realized until now how hollow that advice was. His father had been a man of power, but he had never taught him how to love, how to cope with loss, how to truly live. Marcelo had spent so much of his life chasing after the things his father had valued that he had never stopped to ask himself what he truly wanted. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his reverie. He glanced at the screen, another meeting reminder, another task to be checked off. But today, none of it mattered. Marcelo stood up abruptly, the decision made. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and left the office without a word to his assistant. The meeting could wait. Today, he was going to confront his past, and he didn't care what it took to do it. As he walked out of the building and into the crowded city streets, the noise of the world around him seemed to fade into the background. The weight of the decisions ahead felt heavy, but also strangely freeing. He was no longer hiding from the truth. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, or if he'd even find it. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He was going to find Jose. He was going to listen to him again, because somehow, Jose had understood him when no one else had. Maybe he could help Marcelo understand himself. Marcelo stopped for a moment, his gaze wandering across the busy street. People rushed past him, heads down, lost in their own worlds. He thought of Jose, the man who had lived on the streets for so long, yet had never stopped looking up, never stopped seeing the world for what it truly was. Marcelo envied that. He envied Jose's ability to see beyond the pain, beyond the facade of success. For the first time in a long time, Marcelo realized that he had been the one who was blind. Blind to his own emptiness. Blind to the people around him. Blind to the truth that had been right in front of him all along. And now, as he set out to find Jose, he was determined to stop hiding, stop running. He was ready to face whatever truth lay ahead. Marcelo walked aimlessly through the city streets, his footsteps quick, yet unsure. The weight of the decision hung heavily on his chest, each step feeling more uncertain than the last. He had made up his mind to find Jose, but he hadn't planned what would happen once he did. The unknown stretched before him like an endless road with no signs, no clear direction. The truth was Marcelo didn't know how to help Jose. He didn't even know if Jose would accept his help. Could he, someone who had never known true hardship, really understand what Jose had gone through? Could he offer anything of value to a man who had lived through so much? He stopped at a street corner, watching the traffic move around him. The city was alive with movement, people rushing to and fro, their lives so different from the slow, deliberate pace of Jose's world. Marcelo realized he had been disconnected from the real world for far too long. His high-rise office, his wealth, his status. None of it had prepared him for what he was facing now. None of it had prepared him for the vulnerability that Jose had forced him to confront. Marcelo's phone buzzed again, but he ignored it. His focus was on something else now. He wasn't just looking for Jose. He was searching for something deeper, something he had been missing for years. It was in the middle of his wandering that he saw a familiar face. It was a man he recognized from the day before, standing in front of a small diner. The man's clothes were worn and ragged, and his face, though familiar, carried the marks of someone who had spent too many days living on the edge. Marcelo hesitated for a moment, his heart racing in his chest. Could this be Jose? He approached cautiously, the man not noticing him at first. The closer Marcelo got, the more he saw the resemblance. The same weary eyes, the same haunted expression. And then the man turned, locking eyes with him. Marcelo? The voice was rough, yet there was a strange familiarity in it, like Jose had been waiting for him all along. Yes, Marcelo said, almost unsure of his own voice. Jose. The man nodded, his lips curling into a half-smile. I knew you'd come. You always do. But you're too late, my friend. There was a bitter edge to his words, but it wasn't anger. It was resignation. I've been looking for you, Marcelo said, his voice filled with a mix of urgency and uncertainty. I want to help. You don't have to live like this. Jose laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Help? You think you can help me? You can't help me, Marcelo. You don't even understand the first thing about me. Marcelo felt a sting, but he didn't back away. I want to understand. Please, let me help you. For a moment, Jose didn't speak, just stood there, studying Marcelo. Then, slowly, he took a step back, shaking his head. You want to help, huh? Jose asked, his voice quieter now, more serious. Then help yourself first. Until you can look at the world without all those walls, without that mask of success, you won't be able to help anyone. Especially not me. Marcelo's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on his ability to fix things, to solve problems. But Jose's words struck deep. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to begin. Jose, I don't understand, Marcelo admitted. I thought I could fix things, I thought I could help. But I don't know how to fix myself either. Jose stared at him for a long moment, his gaze softening. That's the first step, Marcelo, he said quietly. Admitting you don't have all the answers. That's where it begins. Marcelo stood there, overwhelmed. He had spent so many years chasing the wrong things, pretending that his money and success could fill the emptiness inside. But now, standing in front of Jose, he felt the weight of his own brokenness, the truth he had been avoiding for so long. I don't know where to go from here, Marcelo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jose reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's okay. You're not alone. But you've got to start looking inside yourself before you can help anyone else. The words were simple, yet they resonated deep within Marcelo. For the first time in a long time, he felt a crack in his armor. It was small, but it was enough. Let's walk together, Jose said after a pause, his voice quieter, almost like an invitation. I don't have the answers either, but maybe we can figure it out one step at a time. Marcelo nodded, the weight of the world still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time, it didn't feel quite as unbearable. He didn't have all the answers. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Together, they walked down the busy street, the sound of the city surrounding them. And for the first time in years, Marcelo didn't feel alone. The city seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because Marcelo had. Each step he took alongside Jose felt like an unraveling. A slow shedding of the layers he had so carefully built around himself. The streets were still chaotic, still filled with the usual rush of people, the honking of cars, the endless noise of a city that never stopped. But today, the noise felt distant, muted, as if he were hearing it through a fog. They walked in silence for a long time, not needing words. Marcelo didn't know where they were going, and at that moment it didn't matter. He was just walking, letting the weight of the conversation from earlier settle in his chest. Jose had been right, hadn't he? Marcelo had spent so many years living behind his walls of success, behind his perfect image, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the things. All of it, the high-rise offices, the luxury cars, the expensive suits, had only kept him from seeing the real world. The world that Jose had seen. The world that had broken him and rebuilt him in ways Marcelo could never understand, but that he now longed to. At some point, they ended up in a quiet part of town, an area far from the glitz and glam of Marcelo's life. The buildings here were old, their brick walls chipped and weathered. Small cafes lined the street, their windows fogged with steam. There was a stillness to this place that felt foreign to Marcelo, but it was also strangely calming. Jose led him to one of the cafes, a modest little spot with a neon sign flickering overhead. "Let's sit," Jose said, pushing open the door and stepping inside. Marcelo followed him, the warm air inside a sharp contrast to the chill of the streets. They found a corner table, and as they sat down, Jose's eyes seemed to soften. There was no judgment in his gaze, no anger, just a quiet understanding. Jose ordered 2 cups of coffee, and when he returned with them, Marcelo found himself staring into the black liquid, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer heavy with uncertainty. "So, what now?" Marcelo asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jose took a sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "What do you want, Marcelo? What do you really want?" Marcelo hesitated. What did he want? The question was more complicated than he had imagined. For so long, he had wanted more success, more money, more status. But none of that had ever truly filled him. It had always felt like something was missing, a hole inside him that he couldn't name. But now, sitting here in this small cafe, with Jose across from him, he realized that it wasn't more that he needed. It was less. "I want to feel whole," Marcelo admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I want to stop pretending. I want to stop hiding behind this image I've created. I want to know who I really am. But I don't know how." Jose leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady. "That's the first step, Marcelo. Admitting you don't have all the answers. That's what I meant when I said you had to start looking inside yourself. We all have our own battles, our own wounds. But it's only when you stop running from them that you can begin to heal." Marcelo stared at Jose, his heart heavy with the weight of the words. He had been running for so long, trying to outrun the pain, the emptiness. But now, the walls were coming down, one brick at a time. "And you?" Marcelo asked quietly, his voice filled with a new curiosity. "How did you do it? How did you survive all of this? All that you've been through?" Jose smiled, a small, wistful smile. "I didn't. Not at first. I kept running too, just like you. But eventually I realized something. I realized that there's no real running from the truth. You can't escape it. Not forever. And the more you try, the more it tears you apart inside." Marcelo listened intently, hanging on every word. There was something raw in Jose's voice, something that spoke of a life Marcelo could never truly understand, but now he wanted to. "I lost a lot," Jose continued, his voice quieter now. "But I also gained something. I learned how to be real, to accept the broken parts of myself. And when you do that, when you stop fighting the parts of you that hurt, it's like a weight is lifted. You start to see things differently. You start to see people differently." Marcelo felt a lump form in his throat. The idea of accepting his own brokenness, of confronting the parts of himself that he had always tried to hide, terrified him. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he had a choice anymore. He was tired of pretending he had all the answers, that everything was fine. Tired of the perfect image he had built, a facade that had kept everyone, including himself, at arm's length. As he looked at Jose, he realized something else, something that made his heart ache with the force of it. "I'm sorry," Marcelo whispered. "For everything. For not seeing. For not understanding." Jose met his gaze, his eyes soft and kind. "You don't have to apologize, Marcelo. You're here now. That's what matters." The words were simple, but they struck deep. Marcelo felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a release he hadn't known he needed. For the first time in a long time, Marcelo felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But for the first time in years, it didn't matter. He wasn't alone anymore, and that in itself felt like a beginning. The days that followed were a blur, each one merging into the next with a quiet intensity. Marcelo and Jose continued their journey together, but it was a journey of the mind more than of the streets. Marcelo didn't know it yet, but he was slowly learning how to listen, not just to the words others said, but to the silence, to the things unspoken. He had returned to his high-rise apartment that night after their conversation, his mind swirling with the things Jose had shared. But sleep didn't come easy. He kept replaying the moments, the way Jose's eyes had softened when he spoke about his past, the weight of his words about brokenness, about healing. It unsettled him, made him question everything he had believed in, everything he had worked so hard to build. At first, Marcelo had tried to bury it, to tell himself that Jose's experience was unique, that it didn't apply to him, that his life was different. But deep down, a part of him knew better. He couldn't deny the truth Jose had spoken, the truth about the walls he had built around himself, the truth about the emptiness he had spent so many years trying to fill. The next morning, Marcelo went to his office with the same intent he always had: work, meetings, numbers. But nothing felt the same. The glass windows, the sleek furniture, the sound of phones ringing and keyboards clacking. It all felt distant, like a world he no longer understood. It wasn't just the walls around his office that had changed. It was the walls around himself. Walls he hadn't known were there until Jose had made him see them. And then there was the truth he hadn't been able to face, the truth that Jose's words had made him realize. The people he had helped, the charitable acts he had performed, they had been done from a place of guilt, not from true compassion. He had tried to buy his way out of his own pain, tried to make up for a childhood where he had felt neglected, invisible. He had thought that if he gave enough, did enough, he could silence the echoes of that child who had never felt good enough, who had always been desperate for love. But it didn't work. It never had. Marcelo couldn't remember the last time he had really looked at someone, really seen them. He had always been too busy, too distracted by his own needs to understand the needs of others. He had taken from people, used them to feel validated, to prove that he mattered. He had been blind to their struggles because he was too focused on his own. The truth was, Jose hadn't been the only one who had been broken. Marcelo's life had been a careful construction of successes and distractions that had kept him from facing the truth about himself. He had spent his life running, and in the process, he had never learned how to be present, how to truly connect with anyone, least of all himself. That afternoon, Marcelo found himself standing in front of his office window, looking out at the city below. It was a perfect view, one that most people would envy, but it felt cold to him now. He had always thought that the view from the top would bring clarity, that it would make everything easier to understand. But all it had brought him was a sense of isolation, a feeling that no matter how high he climbed, he was still looking down on everyone, still keeping himself apart. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from Jose. "Meet me. I have something to show you." Marcelo's heart skipped a beat. He had grown used to the quiet strength of Jose's messages. No urgency, just a steady calm that made Marcelo feel like he could breathe again, even in the chaos of his own mind. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and left the office, stepping into the elevator and heading down to the street. He didn't know what Jose wanted to show him, but he knew, without a doubt, that it was something important. When Marcelo arrived at the small cafe where they had met before, he saw Jose sitting at their usual corner, waiting. He looked up as Marcelo walked in, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was no judgment in Jose's gaze, no impatience, just understanding. Jose motioned for Marcelo to sit. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jose began, his voice calm but serious. "About wanting to help, about wanting to change." Marcelo nodded, unsure of what to say. He had been thinking about it too. Jose took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been through a lot in my life, things I don't talk about much, but I've learned something in all that pain. I've learned that we can't fix anyone until we fix ourselves. We can't save anyone until we can save ourselves." Marcelo felt his throat tighten. He had been trying to fix everything around him, trying to find redemption in the things he did for others. But what if the real redemption wasn't in helping others? What if it was in helping himself first? You're not going to find the answers in your office or your car or your bank account, Jose said, his eyes intense now. You're not going to find it in any of the things you've built. You have to look deeper than that. Marcelo nodded slowly, his mind spinning. I don't know if I can. I've spent so long hiding from everything. From who I am. From the things I've done. Jose leaned forward, his voice softer now. That's the first step. Owning up to it. Owning up to the fact that you've been running from your own pain. We all have scars, Marcelo. The question is, what are you going to do with them? Marcelo's eyes stung with unshed tears, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to hide it. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice raw. I don't know where to go from here. Jose placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. The answer is inside you. It always has been. You just have to let go of the idea that you have to be perfect, that you have to have it all together. Marcelo's chest tightened, but this time, the pressure wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he had thought. Maybe the journey wasn't about fixing everything, about building the perfect life. Maybe it was about learning to live with the broken parts, to accept them, and to heal. Maybe that was enough. The days blurred together as Marcelo tried to absorb everything Jose had said, tried to make sense of his own emotions, of his own past. He couldn't shake the image of Jose's steady eyes, the words that had cut through his well-built armor. He kept thinking about the scars Jose had spoken of, how everyone carried them, how they shaped who we were. Marcelo spent a lot of time walking in the city, as if the constant movement could help him piece together his thoughts. The city was alive, vibrant, full of people hustling through their daily lives, each of them carrying their own invisible burdens. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Marcelo felt a connection to them. Not because of the wealth he had accumulated, not because of the buildings he owned, but because of something deeper, a shared vulnerability. He had always been so focused on what he could gain, on how to maintain his success, that he had ignored the human connections all around him. He had kept his relationships transactional, his acts of charity distant. But now he saw the world differently. He saw faces, stories, struggles. He saw himself. And that's when it happened. The moment that forced Marcelo to finally confront his past. It was late one afternoon when he received a call from his mother. They hadn't spoken in weeks. She had always been a distant figure in his life, someone he respected but never truly connected with. He had always told himself that their strained relationship didn't matter. But now, as he heard her voice on the other end of the line, something inside him shifted. Marcelo, her voice was strained, distant, as it always was. I need to talk to you. Can you come by the house? His heart sank. There was a weight in her words that he hadn't expected. He agreed to meet her, but a part of him was already bracing for whatever was coming. When he arrived at her home, a modest house in the suburbs, the sight of it was strangely familiar. The walls, the smell of old wood, the worn furniture, it all felt like a ghost of his childhood. But there was something new, something in his mother's eyes that made him uneasy. She wasn't sitting at the kitchen table like she usually did when he visited. Instead, she was standing by the window looking out at the empty street. "Mom?" Marcelo called, his voice hesitant. She turned slowly, her face tired but calm. She motioned for him to sit. "There's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago." Marcelo sat down, his stomach tightening. His mother's eyes were tired, filled with years of regret, and something else, something he couldn't name. But it was enough to make his heart beat faster. "I've been keeping something from you," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "Something I thought would protect you. But I see now that it only hurt you more. I didn't want you to know this, but I think it's time you did." Marcelo leaned forward, his curiosity piqued, but his chest heavy with unease. "You were never meant to grow up the way you did," she continued. "You were always meant for more than this life. But I made choices, bad choices, and I kept them from you because I didn't want to burden you. I didn't want you to see the brokenness in me." Marcelo's mind raced. His mother's words didn't make sense. He had always known there were things left unsaid between them. But now it seemed like the entire foundation of his life was cracking. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath and finally met his eyes. I never wanted you to know about your father, Marcelo. The man who raised you, he wasn't your real father. Your real father was someone else. And the reason I never told you was because of what happened to him. And what happened to me. You were never supposed to know the truth. But now I can't keep it from you anymore. The words hit him like a tidal wave. The room seemed to spin, and Marcelo had to grip the armrest to steady himself. His mind struggled to process the information. He had always known there was something off, something unsaid, but this, the truth of his father's identity, was more than he had ever expected. You're telling me that the man I grew up with wasn't my father? Marcelo's voice was shaky, his mind a blur. Then who was he? And why didn't you tell me? His mother closed her eyes, as if bracing herself. I couldn't, Marcelo. The man who raised you was a good man, but he wasn't the one who should have been there. Your real father was someone who loved me, but it wasn't meant to last. He was gone long before you were born. Marcelo couldn't breathe. His mind raced with questions, but one feeling stood out above all others: betrayal. The foundation of his identity, the things he thought he knew about himself, had all been shattered in a matter of seconds. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have made him live with a lie? I don't understand, Marcelo whispered, his voice cracking. Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why? His mother's face was lined with years of guilt, and she reached out to touch his hand. Because I thought it would break you, Marcelo. I thought you needed that man to be your father. I thought that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't be able to handle it. Marcelo pulled his hand away, his heart racing with a mix of anger, confusion, and sorrow. I didn't need a lie, Mom. I needed the truth. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on him. Marcelo stood up abruptly, the urge to escape overwhelming him. He had to leave, to think, to process everything. But as he turned to go, his mother's voice stopped him. I'm sorry, Marcelo, she whispered, her voice full of regret. I never meant to hurt you, but it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and everything had changed. Marcelo didn't know what to do with this new version of himself, with the reality that everything he thought he knew about his life had been a lie. All he could feel now was the deep emptiness that had always haunted him. Only now it was magnified, louder, and more insistent. As he left the house, the weight of his mother's words pressed down on him. But there was something else, something that felt like a flicker of possibility, a chance to finally confront the past, and with it a chance to truly heal. The air felt different as Marcelo stood in front of his mother's house, the weight of her confession still heavy in his chest. His mind couldn't quiet, the noise of betrayal, confusion, and regret all swirling together like a storm he had no control over. He walked aimlessly, not really knowing where he was going, but needing to put distance between himself and the moment. He'd always thought that if he could climb high enough, if he could build enough, if he could hide behind enough walls, he could escape his pain. But the walls had started to crumble. He had faced the truth about his mother, the truth about his past, and now he had to face something even more difficult: himself. He found himself back at the small cafe, the place where it all began. It was quieter now, the afternoon sun casting a soft golden light through the windows. And there, sitting at the same corner table, was Jose. He looked up as Marcelo walked in, his eyes soft but knowing. There was no judgment in Jose's gaze, just understanding, a look that said he knew the journey Marcelo was on, that he had been through it himself. Marcelo sat down across from him, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. You were right, Marcelo said, his voice low. All along, you were right. Jose didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply waited, as if giving Marcelo the space to find his own words. I've spent my whole life trying to fix everything around me, trying to control it all, Marcelo continued, his hands clenched tightly together on the table. But I've never faced what's inside me. I've never faced the truth about my past, my family, or what I've been running from. Jose nodded, his expression calm but resolute. You can't change what's been done, Marcelo, but you can change how you move forward. You can decide who you want to be now. That's the real power. Marcelo swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep into his bones. He had always thought that fixing the outside world would somehow fix him, but now he understood. The healing had to start from within. I don't know how, Marcelo said, his voice breaking. I don't know where to start. Everything feels broken. Jose's eyes softened with empathy. We're all broken in some way, Marcelo. It's part of being human. But it doesn't mean we can't rebuild, piece by piece. And sometimes we can't do it alone. Sometimes we need to let others in. Marcelo's mind flashed to his mother's words about the secret she had kept, the years she had hidden the truth from him. It hurt more than he had expected, but it also made something inside him stir. A recognition that he wasn't the only one with pain, that maybe there was room for understanding, even in the messiness of the truth. I don't think I can forgive her, Marcelo whispered, more to himself than to Jose. Not yet. Not after everything. Jose's gaze didn't waver. Forgiveness doesn't mean you forget. It means you let go of the anger that keeps you tied to the past. It means you free yourself from it. You can't carry that weight forever, Marcelo. It'll crush you. Marcelo stared at the table, the thought of forgiveness feeling like an impossible mountain to climb. But Jose's words echoed in his mind. Let go of the anger. Free yourself. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he would ever fully understand his mother's choices, or why she had kept the truth from him for so long. But he did know this. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The walls he had built around himself had to come down, and the only way to rebuild was to face the mess inside. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, Marcelo said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jose smiled gently. You don't have to be ready. You just have to take the first step. That's all anyone can do. Marcelo looked up, meeting Jose's steady gaze. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. There was a quiet sense of peace that washed over him, a recognition that he wasn't expected to have everything figured out. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to begin. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was understanding. Marcelo realized he wasn't seeking some grand revelation. He wasn't waiting for a dramatic moment that would solve everything. What he needed now was to embrace the journey, to allow himself to heal, even if it meant taking small steps. I've spent so long trying to be something I'm not, Marcelo said, his voice filled with quiet resolution. But I think it's time I stop pretending. It's time to face what's inside. It's time to be real. Jose nodded, his eyes filled with quiet pride. That's all you can do, Marcelo. That's enough. For the first time in years, Marcelo felt like he was finally on the right path. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing. He wasn't running anymore. As he left the cafe, the evening sky stretched above him, darkening as the stars began to appear. Marcelo walked slowly, the weight of the world on his shoulders, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel unbearable. He was taking steps toward something new, toward healing, toward the truth. And that, he realized, was enough. In the end, Marcelo's journey teaches us a powerful lesson. No matter how high we build our walls or how deep we bury our pain, true healing begins when we stop running from the truth. It's in facing our scars, embracing our vulnerability, and taking the first step toward change that we truly find freedom. Now, ask yourself, are you ready to confront your own truths? Are you ready to start your own journey of transformation? If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with those who need to hear this message. Hit like, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful story is the one we share together.